Good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining us, or good evening if you're in the US or anywhere else in the world. Good day, good evening, good night. Glad to see you joining us. It's fantastic to have such a big group of people. My name's Gabby. I'm the CEO of Modern Money Lab. I'm here with Stephen Hale and Stephanie Kelton for this talk in our Economics of Sustainability 2024 lecture series. And we'd love to thank Stephanie for giving us her time to talk to us today about finding the money, which is a really important thing that we all need to know about, and also the title of a new movie, which is coming up, a documentary featuring Stephanie, which we'll get into a bit later. Just before we start the session, I'd like to acknowledge that in Adelaide, we are living and working on the land of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains. I'd like to acknowledge that this land was never ceded, and we pay our respects to elders past and present. And I'm going to hand over to Stephen now.
A very warm welcome to everyone, especially if you're joining us live from somewhere where it's very late at night or very early in the morning. It's a great pleasure to see so many people on the list of names. I can see a lot of names that are familiar to me and a lot of names that aren't. Thank you all for coming. Before welcoming our guests, I'd like to say that this series of interviews and talks has been organised by Modern Money Lab. Modern Money Lab is a registered charity headquartered in Adelaide, South Australia, and where Gabby and I are sitting, which we set up about 3 years ago now, mainly to answer the question, where can I study modern monetary theory and ecological economics? We wrote a graduate certificate, graduate diploma, and master's degree so that for the first time, wherever you are in the world, there's an answer to this question. And we were lucky enough to find a university that was prepared to partner with us to offer these courses. We'll be starting our 5th trimester in February, and we'd love it if you could join us on the graduate certificate to empower yourself to debate economic issues with anyone, or on the full master's to train as a professional economist. Stephanie needs no introduction, really. She's a professor of public policy at Stony Brook University, author of the best-selling book, The Deficit Myth, a former chief economist on the US Senate Committee on the Budget, and I mustn't forget to add also an honorary or adjunct professor at our partner, Torrens University Australia, among many other things. So I'd just like to say welcome, Stephanie.
Very nice to be with all of you.
Let's start with the movie, since Gabby just mentioned it, Finding the Money, which I hope wherever people are in the world, they'll get to see at some point this year, and which we're touring with the director, Maren Poitras, around Southeast Australia in March. How did the movie come about?
Well, this is Maren's idea. You know, she sort of took an interest, and she can give you obviously a better answer than I can, because she will know, you know, what inspired her to seek us out and to find the connections that she found between the work that many of us were doing as economists, specifically within the MMT macro framework, and her own interest in the environment and sustainability. And so, you know, we were doing work, and I think it goes all the way back to really the very earliest stages of MMT with people like Matthew Forstater, who was a colleague of mine at the University of Missouri in Kansas City, where I taught for 17 years. And Matt was always doing work in this space. I mean, environmental, I think he used to teach, and probably still does, courses like environmental economics. So there were at least some MMT economists from the very beginning whose work incorporated these sorts of questions around climate and sustainability. I don't remember, to be honest, when I first had a conversation with Maren. I know that she
It's a long time ago, though, isn't it?
It was years ago. This film is many years in the making, and I think that and again, she could correct me if I get this wrong, but as I remember it, her original idea was to do a film that was a bit different from what she ended up doing, I think. I was giving a talk, many of us were, at Harvard University, and there's a group here of activists, and they call themselves the Sunrise Movement. And someone organized a conference up at Harvard and brought many scholars and activists, legal scholars, economists, historians, and others together. I remember her being there and filming. And after a period of time, I guess the movie started to take shape, the story started to take shape in her mind. And it became one that sort of centered my intellectual journey as one of a number of economists who had contributed to the scholarly literature around MMT. And she said, look, I think this is sort of the missing ingredient in the climate fight. I mean, it is a fight for our lives and a fight of our lives. And she saw the work we were doing as integral and as useful to that movement. And I think the film is her effort to bring the story together so that when we, hear people talk about how much money it's going to cost to tackle the imminent, challenge that we're facing with respect to climate breakdown, how will you pay for it? And Marin wanted to use that as, I think, an entry point to say, this is the wrong question. And, I laid this out at Harvard that, in fact, finding the money is the easiest part of the whole challenge. It's everything else that's really hard, that's going to require a lot of thoughtful, hard work on our part. But finding the money is the easy part. And I think that's the story she wanted to present.
Well, that's a great answer. Someone asked me yesterday in a meeting, actually, somebody who's here today, to summarize the movie in 60 seconds. And I had a go, but I didn't do it that well. It's very difficult to do so because it covers so much ground. Actually, I think I started and was still talking 5 minutes later. But it's a great movie. But just before moving on from the movie, if you are in South Australia and you haven't booked to come and see it yet, then please do. I knew it was going to be good before I saw it for the first time, but it was much better than I expected it to be. It's a great achievement of Marin putting the movie together.
Stephen, she put it together so beautifully. And one of the things that the film really does is it is an indictment of modern mainstream economics. I mean, that is a very big part of what it is that she's attempted to do in this film, is to reveal how much they get wrong and what the costs are for all of us if we continue down this path of asking the wrong questions and then answering them incorrectly on top of that, and the price that we'll pay collectively as a civilization. And I think it really does a beautiful job of breaking it down and presenting it in a way that's really accessible to people, because these are lofty fights that economists have about, macroeconomic theory and all this kind of stuff. And she really makes it, I think, very accessible to a lay audience, just what the issues are, what's at stake, and why the role of economists has been both so important in bringing us to the place that we are in the current debate, and why it's been so problematic.
Yeah, and I don't know whether this is being facetious, but if anybody enjoys seeing famous economists making a complete fool of themselves, then this is the movie for you. Yes, I won't name them.
As
You're concerned. I heard you.
No spoilers.
Pardon? No, I'm not going to spoil.
No spoilers. No.
I heard you the other day being interviewed on NPR about the US national debt going over $34 trillion. I mean, to most people, $34 trillion may as well be $24 trillion, or it's just a huge number. People, maybe even more in the US than here, seem to be scared about the national debt. They've always been scared about the national debt. What is the national debt? What are people scared of? What are they getting wrong?
Well, let's talk about what people are scared of. What people are scared of are the things that they have been told about the national debt that are supposed to personally jeopardize their futures. That's what it's about. You know, if you just thought, oh, well, it's a big number, but it doesn't connect to me in any way, you probably wouldn't worry very much. But when they say things like, because of this very large number, because we have this national debt hanging over our heads, it is going to mean a bleak future for our children and grandchildren. It is going to force us to make tough choices with respect to the federal budget, because so many dollars have to be diverted to repaying the debt that money won't be available for education, healthcare, other priorities that are important to people. And so people hear those kinds of, you know, like every day in the newspaper, on the radio, on television, you know, somebody is spinning a tale of woe about the so-called national debt and making it very personal. And, you know, we've got a big billboard in New York City. It used to be situated right there in Times Square, and they've moved it to sort of a side street, but it's still there, and you can walk by, and this thing towers over you, and the numbers changed in real time. So you just look up and you see click, 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 and the numbers getting bigger and bigger. And then down below that big headline number, it says your share. And then it's, you know, the per capita. So you take the total debt and divide by the size of the population. And then you're told this is how much you're personally on the hook for. Well, of course, people get worried. You know, they'll say that it's going to mean a future of a crushing burden of taxes in the future, that, you know, they're going to come for your wallet, and you're going to have to pony up the funds to pay this all back. So you said, what do they get wrong? Everything I just said is wrong. Everything they say is wrong. So what, you know, what I think creates so much anxiety, both the fact that it's going to hit you personally, but also just the word debt, right? Just the fact that we are so conditioned to have a sort of visceral reaction to the word debt. I mean, we probably all have a credit card. You use your credit card, but you know, you have to be careful. The last thing you want is to go to the mailbox every month and find a statement with a number that's growing, and you feel like there's no end. You know, how am I ever going to pay this off? We're careful with, you know, other sorts of debt, borrowing and that sort of stuff. We know people can end up in trouble. You can go broke. We've seen businesses and companies, you know, have trouble with debt and file bankruptcy. So we understand that debt can become a problem. And then when we hear that the federal government is deeply in debt, the only way we know to sort of make sense of it is to liken it to our own personal finances. So then people take advantage of that, you know, the fact that we don't have a better understanding, and they say, well, just like you, right, the government's going to end up running out of money or going broke or all of this sort of stuff. Okay, so what do we get wrong? Well, the federal government is not like the rest of us. Okay, and the main way that we like to try to explain the difference in pretty simple terms is to say the federal government issues the currency. In Australia, your government issues the Australian dollar. Here in the US, the government is the issuer of the US dollar. The Japanese government issues the yen, and the British government issues the pound, and so forth, right? So if you were the issuer of the currency, would you ever worry about running out of money? No, I wish I could do it, right? I can't. It's illegal. It's called counterfeiting if I try to create the US dollar. So I can't run out of money. I can't face bills coming due in dollars that I can't afford to pay if I'm the federal government of the United States, or if you're the Australian government. So you're not going to run out of money. You're not going to go broke. Why do you have to borrow? Why do governments go into debt? Okay, and that gets into a whole deeper conversation. But let me just say the simple thing that people need to understand is that the thing that we call the national debt is nothing more than our after-tax savings. That's what it is. So one simple example, and then I'll stop. The deficit is the difference between two numbers. That's all it is, right? The first number is called outlays, how many Australian dollars the government puts into somebody's hands every year. The other number is called receipts. How many do they subtract away from people, mostly through taxation? So this thing we call a deficit is the difference between those two numbers, right? If the government spends more than it collects back, mostly in taxes, we say the government has run a deficit. When the government matches its deficit by selling securities, in our case, US treasuries, those treasuries become financial assets to their holder, but we call it adding to the national debt. And so when the government chooses to allow us to trade in some of our dollars for these interest-bearing dollars, we call it borrowing, and we say the government is going into debt. But what's really happening is that the government is just facilitating our savings. When it adds more than it subtracts, it's making a financial contribution. The rest of us, somebody gets to hold those as part of their wealth, part of their savings.
Yeah, so in Australia, they're part of our superannuation funds. And people often make a fuss about foreign investors owning part of the government's debt, but all that is that we don't ban foreign investors from buying the government's bonds on the secondary market. And if they want to hold Australian dollars, then rather than holding them in Australian bank accounts, if they want something even safer than those, they can buy government bonds. That's how they end up holding them. We don't depend on the rest of the world to buy our government's debt either, do we? And the US doesn't depend on China to provide it with US dollars. You say that.
It's basically like the government can issue two different instruments. And one we could call currency, and the other we call, securities. They're both dollars. It's just that, one of them comes with an interest payment in the case of bonds. So it will throw off some additional dollars over time. And the other one is a non-interest bearing account. So you have like the choice to hold your dollars in a checking account or a savings account. The government is giving us that option to hold some of our dollars in the form of a savings account as opposed to a checking account. That's really all it amounts to. But because we use this word debt to describe the savings account and not the checking account, it leads to lots of, I think, unnecessary anxiety.
Yeah, you reminded me about a couple of really good parts of the movie. Again, not giving it away, but there is one mainstream economist who, in the middle of the movie, is asked, why does the government issue debt in the first place? And he realizes halfway through his answer that he doesn't know the answer to that question, and he can't think of an answer that makes sense. That's one of my favorite parts of the movie. And the other thing you just reminded me of is how Marin uses symmetry so nicely in the movie and to promote the movie as well. And of course, you've just been talking about symmetry there, which is that when the government runs a deficit, they are giving us more dollars than they're taking away from us. So we're running the surplus when the government runs the deficit. And
I mean, that word is really important, right? Symmetry, because it is matched to the penny, right? The government deficit is mirrored by a financial surplus on the other side of the ledger. So I like to say they're red ink. I don't know if you use that term.
Well, we use it from you. I use your stuff.
Yeah,
yes, red ink and black ink.
Their red ink. Their red ink is our black ink. Their deficits are our financial surpluses, which makes it kind of crazy when you think about, politicians running around pledging that if you vote for me, I promise you I will shrink the size of your financial surplus. Now, they don't say it like that, but when they tell you that by voting for them, you're going to get smaller government deficits, what they are by definition promising you are smaller financial surpluses in the non-government part of the economy. If they said it like that, I have to believe most voters would say, I'm not voting for that guy, right?
Well, they
Why
don't.
would I
Most of them
vote for
don't
that?
understand. And more than
No,
once,
they don't.
more than
No, they
once,
don't.
I've seen on the front page of the Australian Financial Review an article about the government's deficit falling, and next to it an article about household savings falling
Yeah,
at the same time, and they don't make the connection. They don't think there is a connection between the two.
exactly right. Yep.
So should we get rid of the debt, of the so-called debt, the national debt? Or should we stop issuing treasury bonds and do something else?
You know, we have to, it's this word, Stephen, because if the government just ran a deficit and let the dollars accumulate as savings, which they are, right? And we would all say, oh, that's fine. You know, we have dollars and they would show up as liabilities on the central bank balance sheet. But that balance sheet doesn't carry the word debt. The Federal Reserve does not write the word debt on the ledger. And so we just call it reserves. And nobody has a real, you know, panic attack over it. But when those reserves are swapped out for securities, the liability goes on the Treasury's books, right? It's a ledger entry for the US Treasury instead of the Federal Reserve, and it's referred to as part of the publicly held debt. And it's like 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, right? Who do you want to pay the interest, the Fed or the Treasury? And when the Fed pays the interest on assets known as reserves, we just say interest on reserve balances. And that's how we describe it. When the Treasury pays the interest, we say the interest burden on the national debt or something like that. So it's the way we talk about it. And because it's so problematic, and because, you know, I've been at this for like 25 years or more at this point, trying to educate the public. And it's just very hard to break through on a scale that is, you know, large enough to change the conversation. And so if only for that reason, you know, you could convince me to say, just stop issuing the bonds, either issue nothing longer than a 3-month T-bill, set the interest rate, the overnight interest rate, put it back to zero or something very close to zero, and then the conversation would largely go away about interest burden and interest expenditure and all that. And the other option is you could let central banks issue the securities. And that would just make the whole thing much more transparent, that it's about interest rates, it's about maintaining interest rates above zero. The Treasury doesn't have to be the one to issue the securities. The Fed could do it. It would be a lot more transparent. So I think one or a combination of things could help us like move beyond this never-ending battle and conversation about debt default and debt ceilings and burdens and all the rest of it.
Yeah, well, I'd noticed that the debt ceiling in the US at the moment is suspended temporarily. I mean,
well, what did they do? I think yeah, because the language of the last one is sort of, if I might not remember this correctly, but there was a deal reached where they either voted to raise it sufficiently high that it won't become an issue before the next X date.
Yeah, I think it's the beginning of next year. It might be the year after, but
this year, isn't it?
Yeah, but I know there was a price to pay, that everything
Yeah,
is
it's right
supposed to be
after the election. Yep.
Anyway, perhaps we're going off down a path we don't need to go down there. We're not saying that government should never necessarily be in surplus, and we're certainly not saying that government should be spending without limit or shouldn't be budgeting carefully. So what are we saying about how government should go about doing their budgeting?
Well, all right. Let me reinforce what you just said, which is that MMT takes no position in the abstract on whether budgets should be in deficit, small deficit, medium-sized deficit, large deficit, surplus, balance, right? The goal of policy is not to achieve any particular budgetary outcome. The goal of macroeconomic policy is to achieve real outcomes. Now, what those are is a matter of public policy, right? This is what elected officials do, and budgets are a constraining device. They commit financial resources to healthcare, education, infrastructure, and all the rest of it. And they're important both because, you can't have it all. There are limits, and a budget is a necessary and important way to try to structure the commitments and the stress that you're going to place on the economy's productive capacity in any given year or series of years. So you look at a budget and you say, I'm going to put X number of dollars additional into infrastructure this year, next year, and the following year. I have a 3-year bill. Well, okay, that's a 3-year commitment, and it becomes part of the budget. What are you trying to achieve with that? Are you trying to deal with child poverty? Do you have a goal in mind? Are you trying to reduce the rate of childhood poverty, cut it in half every 2 years until it's as close to zero as one can hope to achieve? So real goals, real objectives. I mean, people like Mariana Mazzucato, who many of these people who are here with us now have probably heard, she'll describe mission-oriented, right? Public policy being mission-oriented. What is the mission? What is it you want to deliver through the budgeting process? And committing the financial resources is an important and necessary step, but it's not a sufficient step, because you've also got to be able to manage the spending that you are proposing to do in a way that respects the productive capacity, the limits, the real resource limits of the domestic and any outside capacity you're hoping to use, and also the planetary constraints, the ecological limits. So the real outcomes are what you target, not the budgetary outcomes.
Which kind of feeds on to inflation, really, and what people have sometimes called the cost of living crisis. The inflation rate in both the US and Australia peaked at nearly 8%. In the US, I think one of the measures of inflation, the PCE one, is below 3%. Now it's fallen much more quickly than a lot of people expected, without unemployment having to rise significantly to bring it down. There's been a lot of talk about team transitory versus team permanent as far as inflation is concerned. And you were always on team transitory. Why was that?
Well, for a number of reasons. To have inflation become entrenched in the system and essentially, feed on itself, which is one of the concerns that was raised by economists like Larry Summers. He wasn't alone, but he was probably the most vocal here in the US. And he was worried of a situation where, wages in particular would begin to rise. And then as wages increase, companies would raise prices because their costs are going up, and labor is a huge cost of production. And then workers would, say, I'm not going to work for that because I need more money. And then you get the old wage price spiral. It was very hard to imagine how you were going to have a scenario like that take hold in the US, where, the labor movement has been substantially weakened over the last 40 years.
People like Larry Summers sometimes sound as though they're still living in the 1970s.
Yeah, that was the reference back to either the 60s or the 70s, that we were going to end up in that sort of he would talk about stagflation as well, where you'd end up with very little growth, high unemployment, and high inflation alongside. And of course, none of that is what ended up happening. So, what I was saying from the early stages was that this is a supply shock. This is a negative supply shock. And We in the US in March of 2020, when COVID really hit, we basically told every worker in this country, if you're not essential to the economy, stay home. We didn't have vaccines. We didn't know if we would ever have vaccines. We had, our most famous White House sort of scientists saying it could be 4 or 5 years before we develop an effective vaccine. We didn't know. Businesses were told, don't open your doors. Workers were told, stay home. It was a negative supply shock, and it obviously caused people to spend money very differently. We couldn't go to bars and restaurants and gyms and theaters and nail salons and all of those kind of service-oriented outlets. And we're a service economy. 80% of the US economy is service. And we mostly couldn't do any of those things. So what did we do? Our kids were home from school. We were told to work from home if we could. So you turn your spare bedroom into a home office. You buy new furniture and, desk chairs and tablets and all that kind of stuff. Well, all those things have to be manufactured somewhere. And we've got global supply chains. And so we all remember the fragility of supply chains, right? You had shipping containers that weren't available and shipping costs going up and ships that were backed up at the ports, and we didn't have people to unload them, and trucking, and it all fed into, in various ways, increases in prices early on in goods production. We weren't getting factories that manufacture those little chips, the little semiconductors that go into just about everything now, from washing machines and microwave ovens to PCs and automobiles and all of that. We couldn't get those things. And so used car prices went crazy for a while. And anyway, the point is that we changed our patterns of consumption. We couldn't buy a lot of services, and we tried to cram a lot of dollars into a very narrow and fragile supply chain for goods, and we got inflationary pressures. And so you had to sort of game out whether you thought the increases in inflation that really started April of 2021, you really started to see inflation kind of 4%-ish, and you said, okay, this is twice what the Fed targets. So how should we respond? And the debate about transitory was really among economists saying, does this merit a response by the central bank? Does the central bank need to respond to the increasing inflationary pressures the way it would typically fight inflation, which is by raising interest rates? And I never, not once, not I think in any interview ever, did I take the position that interest rate hikes were the right way to respond to that kind of inflationary pressure that I saw.
I don't think any MMT economist did, to be fair.
No, we didn't think it was the right. We didn't think it was the right medicine. Yeah. And we are skeptical of the transmission mechanism even before COVID. We weren't, as confident as many of our peers in the transmission mechanism. Like, how do rate hikes actually work? Do they work to dampen aggregate demand in a reliable way, and that brings down inflation? Or is it more complicated than that? And can rate hikes actually, under certain circumstances, exacerbate inflationary pressures? So we didn't want to turn to the interest rate tool as a policy response. We said there are a whole bunch of other things that we could do to try to work on the kinds of problems that were creating the inflationary pressure. And President Biden did a lot of that. He said, if we have problems at the ports, and this is part of what's creating some inflationary pressure, let's deal with the problems at the ports. So he ordered, you got to run 24/7. And we're going to help with trucking and licensing, and we're going to get more drivers out there. And if we don't have enough workers in the labor force, and it's getting hard for employers to find the people they need, maybe part of the reason is that millions of workers, especially women, are sitting on the sidelines because they can't find affordable childcare. And so let's deal with that, and we'll try to bring some workers back in. What about immigration? What about, you go down the list, and there are are a whole lot of things that this administration did, later using the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to try to deal with some of the increase in, gas prices that were becoming a hardship for millions of families here. So
and that
that's sort
feeds
of
in a
how
bit to Isabella Weber and strategic price controls, which lots of prominent economists initially, not to name anyone, were very skeptical, even mocking about the
Well, yeah,
idea.
they were. I mean,
Yeah.
they were, and it wasn't just that they were skeptical of the suggestion. She didn't even, there was this little, I don't know if everybody here is familiar, but there's an economist, a young academic at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Isabella Weber is her name. She published a fairly short op-ed in the Guardian newspaper. I don't remember what month that appeared, but inflation was clearly a problem by that time. And she sort of floated the idea that at least some of the higher prices that consumers were facing was perhaps the result of companies taking advantage of the inflationary moment and saying, well, kind of consumers expect to face higher prices when they go into the store, when they, purchase things. So maybe we can get away with pushing prices up even faster than the costs that we're facing, because, we're going to raise prices because our own costs are going up, but maybe we could squeeze out a little bit extra because the consumer is going to be like, well, this is that inflation everyone's talking about. And they won't really balk at it. They'll pay those higher prices. So she said, that could be happening. And to the extent that that sort of stuff is taking place, maybe one might wish to consider the strategic use of some price controls. So it was a very soft, if this is happening, maybe this. She didn't just go in and say, this is what's happening and we need, and a lot of people just had a very negative reaction to even the suggestion that one might look to see whether firms were taking advantage, price gouging, whatever you want to call it, and that price controls could be part of a policy response. So you're quite right.
We had a similar sort of controversy in Australia. There's a body called the Australia Institute that published, drew on Isabella's ideas, I think, and published some research to support that. And for the RBA at the time, it was almost heresy. So
sure, but then you had central banks like the European Central Bank actually start producing studies to say how much of the, call it excess inflation that we're experiencing at the moment, can we trace to, having done too much fiscal stimulus? How much is due to just the pandemic and the supply chains and that sort of stuff? How much is due to what the kind of thing that Isabella pointed to, where they were just quite explicit about it. And they give you a bar graph and tell you how much of the inflation, of the inflationary pressure, they themselves, the ECB, could point to, what's been called seller's inflation or profit-led inflation or whatever. And it's not zero.
Yeah, well, the RBA published research like that. They tended to ignore it in the leading officials when they were discussing these issues in public. But anyway, maybe we better open up to questions soon. But before we do, you've recently announced you'd successfully auctioned another book. Can you tell us anything about that? Or not? I mean, you said it. I didn't announce it. You said.
Well, I don't know. I'm not going to be in a position to say too much. I've got an interview coming out in the FT. I think they're going to run it this week. They've been sitting on it for 4 weeks, I think. They wanted to be able to publish the working title of the book, but I don't think we're going to do that because it's not certain. But let's just say that a lot of the things that we've been talking about here are going to be dealt with in that next book. And I'm excited to have it, to have it in my mind more or less the idea of what it is that I think is important to say for audiences, and to be publishing it with a new editor and with Penguin Random House. Crown is going to publish it in the US. John Murray will publish the UK edition, and they did a wonderful job with the deficit myth, and I was really happy to be able to stay with them for the next book. But broadly, think about inflation deeply.
Okay, well, we look forward to that. We'll be definitely pushing that book around Australia when it comes out.
Yeah.
Gabby, how are we doing with questions?
There's a lot of great questions, actually.
You want to pick one?
Sure. Okay. So the first one I've got is from Michelle. Does national debt affect our credit rating?
Well, it's almost the other way. Well, does national debt affect our credit rating?
I think she's talking from an Australian perspective.
Well, she's talking from an Australian perspective. Should I have a go at that?
Yeah.
Well, sure.
Because a graduate student of mine,
you wouldn't have a credit rating, presumably, if you didn't have the debt to rate. And so the rating agencies are advising investors about, well, Stephen, what do you want to say?
I wanted to say that we had a graduate student who's now a PhD student somewhere in Melbourne, at Adelaide Uni when I was there, called Matthew Crocker, whose thesis I supervised, who looked empirically at the impact of downgradings or warnings on the credit ratings of monetary sovereign governments like Australia. That's a government that, of course, issues its own currency, has no foreign currency denominated debt at all, significantly in a floating exchange rate. And he proved that there is no impact at all on Australian interest rates of changes in the credit ratings of governments like Australia. So as far as the credit rating agencies are concerned, although you wouldn't believe this to listen to our politicians, but federal politicians in countries like Australia should just ignore them. We're not in 1975 now. We don't have a US dollar debt. We don't have a fixed exchange rate. The world is a very different place. The credit rating agencies have no power over the Australian Commonwealth government whatsoever. If only the government realised that, and there's empirical evidence that that's the case.
Well, okay, so let me just jump on that, because the question is clear when you ask, do the rating agencies impact the ability of the government to issue debt like that? That's a no. Could it, does it impact the interest that you have to pay on the debt? It's a no. Could it downgrade have real impacts in terms of public policy if the policymakers themselves view the downgrade as a legitimate warning about the sustainability of a nation's finances, and might that cause them to adjust the budget in ways that make it more austerity, right, driven, because they're fearful of continuing to allow the deficit or whatever? Yeah, that can happen. I mean, we see that here. We get the downgrade of, US treasuries, and all of a sudden, at least a handful of politicians start calling it a warning sign, and then using it to justify, cuts to programs like Social Security and Medicare or other sorts of things. So
there's an irony there, though, isn't it? It's almost a warning that the politicians might do something stupid, because the only risk in the US really is that they don't raise the debt ceiling.
Yeah, I mean, we should probably mention Japan in this context, right? Because one of the examples that we've pointed to for a lot of years is that Japanese government bonds, the rating agencies downgraded Japanese government bonds to a level that was below that of Botswana.
Yes, I was going to say that.
Oh my, right? This must be really bad for the government of Japan. They're going to have a terrible time trying to borrow, and they're going to have to pay exorbitant interest rates and so forth. And of course, all of that is wrong. I think the debt to GDP ratio, gross Japanese government debt, is like 262% at the moment. The Bank of Japan holds some 60% of all the JGBs on its own balance sheet. The central bank has been the overnight interest rate, right? The policy rate has been negative for a period of years. They've been doing yield curve control with the 10-year pinned roughly at zero for much of the last several years. So you don't lose control of interest rates. You don't lose the ability to issue securities or any of those sort of things, even if your so-called debt is downgraded, to sort of third world developing economy that borrows heavily in foreign currencies and all the rest of it.
Some of the confusion came over in the NPR interview when she mentioned Greece to you. I thought, this is an intelligent journalist. It's 2023, nearly 2024. And she's saying, can the US government, maybe she was just asking it to provoke you to answer, but
exactly.
Could the US turn into Greece?
She's great, and they're great. And let me just say, because I did see a lot of people on Twitter, saying not very nice things about NPR and about the host of that program. And I was, kind of bothered by that, because I know what really happened. And so if this is a moment where I could say a couple of words about that, I think, I'd like to do that. So they came to me and they said, there's all this hysteria about the national debt. You have a very different view. We want to have you come on and share your view. So that's what they wanted. And then they have you do a pre-interview so that you talk to the producer, who can then help shape the program, right? But it was a 4.5-minute segment. That's what I was given, 4.5 minutes. And I knew that up front. And so I spent, an hour on the phone with the producer going through all of this. And then they come up with 4 questions. And my job is to respond to those 4 questions in the 4.5 minutes that I've been offered. And I didn't get out that last response quickly enough. And so she had to sort of interrupt and wrap. And a lot of people thought that she didn't want to allow me to give an answer. It wasn't that at all. It was just, you run out of time. It's a tightly scripted show. And she asked the question, not because she thinks the US is like Greece, but because she wanted me to have a chance to explain to the audience why the US is not like Greece.
Which mainly is, of course, because Greece doesn't issue its own currency.
Yeah, or as I put it, I think, to the producer, because we did not make the colossally stupid decision to abandon our sovereign currency and start borrowing in a currency that isn't our own, right? That we can't issue. Greece and by the way, Spain and Portugal and Germany and France and all the rest of them, they abandoned their sovereign currencies and effectively turned themselves into currency using governments, not all that different from California, New York, the state of Georgia, Illinois, Pennsylvania, and so forth, right? So it's a big difference.
And countries like Argentina, Sri Lanka, Turkey, where there's a lot of foreign currency, usually US dollar debt, they're also in a different position to the US.
A lot of foreign currency, a lot of foreign denominated debt, a lot of the budget that is indexed to inflation, a lot more than what we have here, so that when prices start increasing, payments start increasing, so prices increase again, so payments increase again. It's much easier to get that sort of entrenched inflation in countries that have, a lot of indexing.
Well, thanks very much for that question. We went on about it for quite a long time.
I think I've managed to find the link to the NPR radio and popped it in the chat there. Hopefully that link works.
Would you like to
thank
pick
you for the
another
request.
question, Gabby?
Sure. Let's go with the second one that I picked out. There's so many great questions. And I'd like to also acknowledge the students in our program are jumping in and answering quite a lot of people's questions there too. Thank you so much for doing that.
I should think so.
Yes. So this question is from Anne, and it's about messaging, which I'm also interested in as an activist. So what are your thoughts on the slightly inaccurate shorthand? She puts slightly inaccurate in brackets and with a question mark, to say deficits don't matter, and also to say taxes don't fund spending, because it is more complicated than that.
Well, I don't say either of those things. So I don't, that's not part of my.
No, I think she's talking about like people communicating about modern monetary theory online.
Right. But I guess then what I'm trying to say is, well, I don't communicate about MMT using either of those shorthands. If I thought it would be helpful to do so, I guess I would be doing it. But I think I probably try to avoid saying either of those things because I don't think it's helpful. I get it. I know why people want to say deficits don't matter. And what they leave unsaid is the way we've been taught to believe, right?
Mm-hmm.
But to say they don't matter is almost like, well, then we don't need them. You know, if they don't matter, then it doesn't matter if we eliminate them.
They do,
you know what I mean?
Very much, don't they?
They do matter. They do matter. So
Exactly.
that's why, to the extent that I'll say deficits don't matter, I would always bookend it with the way you've been taught to believe. Yeah. And taxes don't fund spending. I mean, that's it's almost, for me, I don't think it helps me advance the larger points that I'm trying to make. So I don't say it. And if you do say it, then of course you're just going to have to fight with deeply held convictions about, you know, why people think they pay their taxes and how this is part of what allows the government to provide, you know, benefits and public services and all the rest of it. But you can challenge that. It just depends who your audience is and how much time you have and which fight you want to pick.
Yeah. There's actually a great question from Rigo, which I'm not taking them in order now, but this one came up, which I thought a lot of people might be interested in. Could you give your take on what the new Argentinian president, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name, Milei, correctly, to what he is trying to do in Argentina to fix the 150% inflation, eliminating the central bank, or what else should Argentina, what other options are there for Argentina if they didn't have a person such as him in charge? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a big question. Look, this is not a new problem in Argentina. And to think that we're going to do in 3 minutes any kind of justice to this question, it's just impossible. He's obviously comes from a very different perspective from the one that I come from. I think clearly, you know, he's a sort of Chicago school, Milton Friedman on steroids kind of guy. He believes, I think, deeply that, you know, the problems that Argentina faces are somehow related to the notion of a fiat currency itself. This talk about, you know, folding up the central bank and all that kind of stuff. I think he's backed away from that. I don't think that's a pledge that he intends to try to keep. Privatizing lots of public assets and pursuing austerity and, you know, not
the first time, is it? It's not the first time they've done. It's not the first time they've done something like this. The 1990s was similar.
Yeah, I mean, it would take so much more time to talk about, you know, the Argentinian economy, and I'm not an expert on the Argentinian economy. I could say much more, but in the time that we have, I don't. We're not even going to scratch the surface. Let's just leave it at, I think his macroeconomic framework is could not be more different from the framework that I operate within, and while bits and pieces of things that he has said are consistent with, what one might do if one was trying to reduce inflationary pressures. It's not completely detached from, reality.
I think
But
people
attributes the problem. What's that?
I think people could look up on Wikipedia or somewhere Argentina's history and just look at the last 150 years in Argentina. There has never been a successful democracy at any stage in 150 years in Argentina, apart from maybe for about 5 years after the last time an experiment like this collapsed in the early 2000s. It's been basically two elite groups fighting and neglecting people in rural communities, and there's never been a functioning democracy. I don't think MNT is a magic wand, and if you don't have decent institutions, and if you don't have a working democracy, then macroeconomic policy, whatever it is not going to solve all your problems for you.
Yeah, this happens in a lot of countries where the exporters are really kind of running the country. There is a very good podcast, David McWilliams, if you know who that is. He's an Irish economist. He has a great podcast, and not so many weeks ago, he had the leader of the opposition party on his podcast to talk about Argentina. And you can get a lot out of that conversation in terms of, how deeply entrenched these problems are, and hear it from Martine, who I think lays out really nicely, what the challenges are and some alternative ways that you could think about, trying to address the problems.
Yeah, there is a talk, not that I go along with absolutely everything in it, but there is a talk by someone we certainly deeply respect, Warren Mosley, on his view of what would be the best thing to do in Argentina on macroeconomics.com. But somewhere at the end, he says something along the lines of, well, I've got an idea what I'd do in Argentina, but there's no way that any political group would be interested in actually trying to do this.
Yeah.
Perhaps just to round it out then, if we come back to the idea of framing, and I've got a question here in a direct message, but I think the gist of it is there anything that we could or should be doing in the public domain that would be most helpful to this cause of teaching people that finding the money is not the problem?
Yeah, show up when your elected officials have, campaign events or meet with their constituents, write letters to the editor, make your voice heard, call into radio programs. If you feel confident that you have a decent grasp of, where the conventional messaging and narrative is going off the rails, and you think you can offer some, helpful way to reframe and get people to think differently. The comments section, I mean, I remember early on, a lot of the early kind of boost to MMT came from people who were following our work, going out and, putting comments in the comments section of the New York Times after a high profile economist, let's call him Paul Krugman, would write a piece. And all of a sudden it would sort of get flooded with comments and links to work that, MMT economists had done. It's irritating to the person who's written the piece, but it's also really helpful because, there's so many people reading that stuff that if they go down and look at the comments and they see somebody saying, this isn't right, what you should read is this other thing. It turns out that can help propagate, the ideas. So
invite people to come to the movie if it's showing anywhere near you.
Come to the movie, take courses if you, but call in, communicate, use your voice.
To be optimistic, the only reason really that I know, Stephanie, is that when I first got interested in MMT, there were so few people who were interested in MMT that it didn't really matter who you were, you knew everyone. Because there were many people to meet. And it's very, very different now.
Very different.
Mm.
Very, very different. Yeah. And thanks to the efforts of people like you, Stephen. I mean,
well, mainly people like you, Stephanie.
Right? No. Takes all of us.
I don't think we'll get time for more questions because we are about to, well, we're over the hour, but I wanted to just tell people that I've posted in the chat a link to the Modern Money Lab website, which has lots of information for people who might be thinking about studying with us. And there's various ways that people can get involved with that. And we have a Q&A plan for new students and potential students coming up in about, well, the same time as this started in 8 days is one of them. And then we have another one a little after that. So we'd love to have you along to those if you're thinking about it and want to just meet us and ask us about it. We also have the next lecture in this series with Professor Joshua Farley from University of Vermont, who is going to be talking to us about ecological economics, and that is in 3 days' time at the same time. Yes, there will be a recording of this emailed out to all the participants and everyone who's registered. And I wanted to just acknowledge that there's been so much interest in this January series. I'm really overwhelmed with the number of people who've booked online to be part of this. You know, we made this free, so you can join in these 6 wonderful talks without paying anything. And actually, people have donated. You are not going to believe this, but nearly $3,500 has been donated just to support this series, which is amazing and wonderful.
The movie tour is quite expensive to organise, so thank you so much.
We are so grateful.
Thank you. We are.
The next lecture is in 3 days' time, not 2.
Let's add the other speakers as well. We have another one of the founders of modern monetary theory, who's Randall Ray, who's doing a talk for us soon on the history of money, which is I've heard him give that talk many times. It's always fascinating. We are going to hear from our great friend Fadel Kaboub, also, who's going to talk about decolonization and decarbonisation. And we're going to hear from our lecturer on our courses, Dirk Enns, who's going to talk to us about the Eurozone. And we have actually 2 ecological economists talking to us, one of whom is at the top of my screen at the moment, actually looking at me, Mark Diesendorf. It would be great to hear from as well, the co-author of the book, The Path to a Sustainable Civilization. I'm really looking forward to that one as well.
Yeah, and just to absolutely clear up the confusion, the next talk in our series is Friday morning for Australians and Thursday evening if you're in the US, just because I can see some dates and times coming in there, and I just wanted to make that clear. We're kind of quite far apart in terms of time zones, so but I'll try and do reminders for everybody so that you know exactly when it is. And of course, a huge thank you to Stephanie, and thank you not only just for this talk, but for being so supportive of what we're doing with our postgraduate qualifications, and for taking the time to come out to Australia and tour around with us. I'm just so looking forward to this. It's going to be an absolute joy. It's wonderful to go around Australia and meet people, and we're going to have an amazing time. And thank you so much for doing it.
Yeah, it's obviously we're a long way apart, so we very rarely get to meet Stephanie. Yeah, but we're really looking forward to it.
Me too. I'm excited to be coming back.
Fantastic. Okay, yes, I can stop the recording now. Thank you very much.
And thanks again, everybody, so much for coming.